The low, steady hum of the jet engines filled the cabin, a sound so constant that after a while the human brain tended to filter it out completely. But for the man sitting in the plush, cream-colored seat near the front, this hum was the soundtrack of success. It was the sound of moving faster than the world below, of rising above the traffic, the noise, and the ordinary people who had to wait in line at security checkpoints. He shifted his weight, sinking deeper into the soft leather that seemed to hug his body. To him, this wasn't just a seat, it was a throne. The interior of the private jet was a masterpiece of modern luxury. There were no heavy wooden doors or clunky fittings. Everything was sleek, polished chrome and white surfaces that reflected the sunlight streaming in from outside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee. This was the domain of the wealthy, a place where problems were left on the ground, or so they liked to believe. The businessman took a sip of his drink, the ice clinking softly against the crystal glass. He was a man who defined himself by what he owned. His watch was heavy and glittered with diamonds. His shoes were handmade Italian leather that had never touched a puddle. He looked around the cabin with a satisfied smirk, his eyes sweeping over the few other passengers and the flight attendants who moved with silent efficiency. He felt powerful here. He felt that the world had finally recognized his importance and given him the VIP treatment he deserved. But his eyes eventually drifted away from the gleaming surfaces and the view of the clouds. They landed on the very back of the plane. It was a darker corner, away from the main flow of light and activity. Sitting there, curled up slightly against the window, was a figure who seemed entirely out of place. The man in the back wore a faded black hoodie. The fabric looked soft, worn thin from years of washing and wearing. On his feet were a pair of scuffed boots, the kind that looked like they had walked miles of city pavement rather than the pristine carpets of a private terminal. He wasn't checking stocks on a tablet or shouting into a phone about a merger. He was just staring out the window, watching the landscape blur far beneath them. His posture was slumped, his shoulders rounded forward as if he were carrying a heavy backpack that no one else could see. The businessman frowned. He hated seeing things that didn't fit his perfect picture. In his world, a private jet was for winners, for people who shouted their success to the skies. This man in the back looked like a loser. He looked like someone you would ignore on a subway platform. "Look at that," the businessman mumbled to himself, the alcohol making his voice louder than he intended. He gestured with his glass toward the back of the plane. A younger man sitting across the aisle, an assistant of sorts, looked up from his laptop. "What is it, sir?" the assistant asked, his tone polite but tired. "Him," the businessman said, pointing a finger. "The guy in the hoodie, what is that about? We are 40,000 feet in the air, flying in style, and he looks like he's waiting for a bus in the rain." The assistant glanced back and then quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. "I don't know, sir, maybe he's tired." "Tired?" The businessman laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed in the quiet cabin. "We're all tired, that's why we fly private. So we don't have to deal with the misery of the commercial world, but he brought the misery with him. Look at him, he looks broken." The businessman swirled his drink, his annoyance growing. He couldn't understand why someone would have access to this kind of luxury, because clearly he must be wealthy to be here and yet refuse to play the part. Where was the joy? Where was the arrogance? To the businessman, money was meant to separate you from the sadness of real life. If you weren't smiling, you weren't doing it right. He watched the man in the hoodie for a moment longer. The man lifted a hand and pushed back his hood. His hair was messy, slightly long. He rubbed his face with a sigh that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. There was no makeup on, no filter. Just a human being looking exhausted. It was Keanu Reeves. He was a man known to millions, a face that had been on posters in bedroom walls and movie screens around the globe. But here, without the lights and the scripts, he was just a passenger. He had just finished a grueling schedule of filming, and more importantly, he was carrying the weight of personal grief that never really seemed to leave him. He valued the silence of this flight. He was grateful for the seat that let him curl up and disappear for a few hours. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he just wanted to be left alone. But the businessman in the front didn't see the movie star. He didn't see the man who had donated millions to children's hospitals or the actor who treated crew members like family. He only saw a guy in cheap clothes who wasn't enjoying the expensive champagne, and that offended him. "Hey," the businessman said, louder this time. He didn't care if the whole cabin heard. He wanted an audience. He stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored suit. He felt a sudden surge of energy, a desire to poke at the sadness in the corner to see if it would react. He was bored, and this was his entertainment. "I'm going to go talk to him," he announced to his assistant, who looked panicked. "Sir, maybe let him rest." "It's a long flight. Relax," the businessman waved him off. "I'm just going to cheer him up. It's depressing looking at him. It's bad for the vibe." He started walking down the aisle. The carpet was so thick his shoes made no sound. The air felt cooler as he moved toward the back, away from the warmth of the sunlight that flooded the front section. As he approached, he could see the man more clearly. He saw the lines on the man's face, the way his dark eyes were fixed on the horizon, seeing something that wasn't there. The businessman stopped a few feet away. He expected the man to turn around, to look startled, perhaps to offer a sheepish apology for looking so poor in such a rich place. But the man didn't move. He just kept looking out the window, lost in his own world. This lack of attention made the businessman angry. He was used to people looking at him when he entered a room. He was used to respect, or at the very least, fear. He took a deep breath, puffing out his chest, ready to deliver a witty remark. He wanted to expose the absurdity of it all, a man sitting in a golden cage, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Nice view," the businessman said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The man in the hoodie slowly turned his head. His eyes were dark, thoughtful, and incredibly sad. He looked up at the looming figure of the businessman, but there was no fear in his gaze. There was only a quiet curiosity. He didn't recognize the businessman. He didn't care about the suit or the watch. He just saw another human being standing there, blocking the light. "It is," the man in the hoodie replied softly. His voice was rough, like gravel crunching on a driveway. "It helps put things in perspective." "The world looks so small from here," the businessman scoffed. He crossed his arms, looking down his nose. "The world is small for us up here, that's the point, we're above it." "But you," he let the sentence hang in the air, a trap set and waiting. "You look like you're still stuck down there in the mud." The man in the expensive suit didn't step back. If anything, he leaned in closer, invading the personal space of the seated passenger. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see the quiet man flinch, or maybe get angry. He wanted to see a crack in the calm surface. But the man in the hoodie just looked at him with eyes that were dark and surprisingly gentle. There was no fear there, and there was no anger either. It was as if he were looking at a misbehaving child rather than a threatening figure. This lack of response only annoyed the businessman more. He was used to people bending to his will. When he walked into a boardroom, people sat up straighter. When he spoke at a restaurant, waiters scrambled. But here, in this quieter corner of the jet, his power seemed to bounce off the other man like water off a stone. "You don't say much, do you?" the businessman asked, his voice taking on a sharper edge. He crossed his arms, making his chest look broader. "I asked you a question. You look like you're stuck in the mud down there. Don't you know where you are?" The seated passenger shifted slightly, turning his body so he was facing the aisle. He didn't stand up. He kept his hands resting loosely on his knees. "I know where I am," he said softly. His voice was calm, with a rough texture to it like sandpaper smoothing wood. "I'm on a plane." "Just like you." The businessman let out a loud, sharp laugh. He turned his head to look at the assistant, who was still watching nervously from the front seat. "Did you hear that? He says we're just the same, like I'm just some guy off the street." He turned back to the man in the hoodie. "We are not the same, pal. Look at this." He gestured to the cabin around them. "This is success. This is what happens when you win. And you," he pointed a finger directly at the man's chest. "You look like you lost your last dollar." The man in the hoodie looked down at the finger pointing at him, then back up at the businessman's face. He didn't swat the hand away. He just waited for the point to be over. "I'm doing okay," he said simply. "I have enough." "Enough," the businessman scoffed. The word seemed ridiculous to him. "There is no such thing as enough. That's the problem with people like you. You settle, you get comfortable being mediocre, you wear." He gestured vaguely at the faded black hoodie. "You wear whatever that is, and you tell yourself you're happy, but you're not. You're miserable. I can see it written all over your face." It was true that the man in the hoodie looked tired. There were deep lines around his eyes and a heaviness to his shoulders that suggested he was carrying a great weight. But it wasn't the weight of failure. It was the weight of life, of loss, and of experiences that went far deeper than a bank balance. He had walked through valleys of shadow that the businessman, with his shiny shoes and private jet, couldn't even imagine. The businessman, however, interpreted the silence as defeat. He felt a rush of satisfaction. He had pegged this guy right. He was a loser, a nobody. Someone who probably snuck onto the flight by mistake, or was a relative of a staff member riding on a discount ticket. The idea that someone could have access to this kind of luxury and not appreciate it made him furious. You know, the businessman continued, his voice dropping to a loud, conspiratorial whisper that everyone could hear. You look like a hitchhiker. Did I pick you up on the side of the runway? Should I be checking your pockets to make sure you haven't stolen the silverware? A few of the other passengers shifted in their seats. One woman, sitting across the aisle, opened her magazine wider, trying to block out the scene. The air in the cabin, which had been crisp and cool, suddenly felt thick and uncomfortable. The businessman's assistant looked like he wanted to disappear into the carpet. The man in the hoodie didn't look around. He kept his eyes on the aggressor. There was a sadness in his gaze now, a pity for the man who needed to punch down to feel tall. I'm not a hitchhiker, he said quietly. And I didn't steal anything. Well, you certainly didn't pay for a ticket looking like that, the businessman sneered. He looked down at the scuffed boots. Those things look like they've walked through a swamp. Why would you wear that on a private jet? Have some respect for yourself. Have some respect for the other passengers. We don't want to look at mess. He sat down in the empty seat directly across from the man in the hoodie, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He wasn't done. He wanted to break through that wall of calm. He wanted to see the man snap. I'm just saying, the businessman said, his tone mockingly helpful. You're in a bubble up here. You're supposed to be enjoying the high life. Instead, you're moping. It's depressing. It's bad for the vibe. When I look at you, I don't see a successful man. I see someone who peaked in the 90s and gave up. Is that it? Did you have one good year and then quit? The man in the hoodie flinched just a little. It was a small movement, a twitch of the eyebrow. The 90s. It was a time long gone, a time of different movies, a different life. He had been famous then, yes. But he had also been younger, and his heart had been whole in a way it wasn't now. The comment hit closer to home than the businessman could ever know, but not for the reasons the bully thought. I've had a long life, the man said slowly. He chose his words carefully. Lots of ups and downs. I'm just tired today, that's all. Tired? The businessman threw his hands up. We're all tired. I slept 4 hours last night because I was closing a deal. I'm running on caffeine and ambition, but I'm not sitting in the corner crying about it. He pointed a finger at the man's face. You see that look? That's the look of a guy who has nothing to live for. If I were you, I'd trade those boots for a tie and get a real job. The man in the hoodie looked at the businessman for a long moment. He was silent for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The hum of the engine seemed to grow louder in the silence between them. Finally, he spoke. His voice was very soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a strange authority. You have a lot of noise inside you, he said. It must be very loud. The businessman blinked. He wasn't sure what that meant. He opened his mouth to make a snappy comeback, to insult the man's hair or his posture, but the words caught in his throat. There was something about the way the quiet man said it. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. It was like being looked at by an X-ray machine that saw past the skin and the suit and the money, right down to the empty space underneath. What are you talking about? The businessman snapped, recovering his composure. I'm not the one acting like a monk in a timeout corner. The man in the hoodie didn't answer. He just gave a small, almost invisible nod, as if he had accepted that the businessman wouldn't understand. He turned his head back toward the window, effectively ending the conversation. He dismissed the wealthy man just as easily as the businessman had dismissed him. This was the worst thing he could have done. The businessman's face turned a shade darker. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment rise up his neck. He had been ignored. He had been analyzed and found wanting. He stood up abruptly, knocking his knee against the small table. Don't turn your back on me, he said, his voice low and threatening. I'm talking to you. The man in the hood didn't turn back. He just stared out at the endless blue sky, his reflection in the glass ghost-like and pale. The businessman stood there, breathing hard. The cabin was completely silent now. Even the flight attendants had stopped moving, standing frozen near the galley, watching the scene unfold with worried eyes. The power dynamic had shifted, though the businessman didn't want to admit it. He was the one with the money and the suit, but he was the one who looked small. He was the one shouting at the wind. And he hated it. He decided right then that he wasn't going to leave this corner until he had wiped that look of calm acceptance off the man's face. He was going to find the button to push. He was going to make him regret acting like he was better than everyone else. "You think you're so deep," the businessman muttered, stepping closer so his shadow fell over the seated man again. "But you're just a sad little man in a big chair, and I'm going to prove it." The businessman stood his ground, feeling the eyes of the cabin upon him. He sensed that the mood had shifted, that the air had grown heavy, but he mistook this silence for respect. He thought the other passengers were holding their breath because they were impressed by his boldness. He didn't realize they were cringing, waiting for the inevitable disaster that comes when ego collides with dignity. He looked back at his assistant and the other passengers, seeking validation. He flashed a grin that was meant to be charming but came across as hungry. "Am I right?" he asked, raising his voice. "We've all seen it, the guy who lives in the past. The guy who tells stories about the glory days while the rest of the world moves on." A few people gave tight, uncomfortable smiles. No one wanted to be the next target. The assistant gave a weak nod, just to keep the peace. This small gesture was all the permission the businessman needed. He turned his attention back to the man in the worn hoodie, ready to deliver the final blow. He wanted to humiliate him completely. He wanted to see that calm face crumble. He pointed a finger directly at the man's feet. "And those boots," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I mean, honestly, look at them. They are falling apart. The leather is cracked. The soles are worn down. Are you making a statement? Is this some kind of protest against fashion?" The man in the hoodie looked down at his feet. He wiggled his toes slightly inside the leather. They were comfortable boots. They had been with him through long nights on set, through walks in the mountains, and through quiet moments of grief where he needed to feel the earth beneath him. They weren't just objects to him, they were companions. "I like these boots," the man said quietly. He looked back up, his eyes meeting the businessman's gaze without wavering. "They're comfortable. They've traveled a long way with me." "Traveled?" The businessman let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Is that what we call it? They look like they've been through a war zone. Or maybe you just don't know how to take care of your things." He leaned in closer, enjoying the smell of his own superiority. "You know, when you have money, you buy quality. You buy things that last. You don't hold on to garbage just because you're nostalgic." The man in the hoodie didn't take the bait. He didn't get angry about the insult to his belongings. He just tilted his head slightly, like a curious bird watching a worm. "I think these boots have a few more miles in them," he said softly. "They still work." "That's enough for me." The businessman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He hated being dismissed with logic. He wanted fire, he wanted passion, he wanted a fight. This calm acceptance was infuriating. It felt like he was shouting at a brick wall. He decided to change tactics. If attacking the man's things didn't work, he would attack the man's life. "You know," the businessman said, crossing his arms again and pacing a small circle in the aisle. "I've seen your type before. You probably had a moment, didn't you? Back in the day. Maybe you were an actor, maybe you were a musician, or maybe you just had a cool job that everyone thought was exciting." He snapped his fingers. "But that was then. This is now." He stopped and pointed a finger at the man's face. "You peaked, and it hurts, doesn't it? You probably sit around telling stories about how great things used to be. Remember the 90s? Remember when I was somebody?" He mimicked a whining voice, mocking the very idea of nostalgia. The mention of the 90s hung in the air. It was a strange coincidence, a random guess that had hit the mark with terrifying accuracy. The man in the hoodie had indeed been somebody in the 90s. He had been on posters, on magazine covers, on the big screen. But he didn't talk about it. He didn't live in the past. He lived with the past, carrying the memories of the people he had loved and lost, but he didn't brag about it. The businessman saw a flicker of something in the man's eyes, a shadow passing over them, and he pounced. "I hit a nerve, didn't I? See, I know people, I can read a room, you're a has-been." You're a guy who had his shot and blew it, or maybe you just got old. And now you're flying on this plane, hoping nobody notices you. He looked around the cabin, addressing the invisible audience again. Look at him. Sitting in the corner, wearing a hoodie like a teenager, but with the face of a man who has seen too many disappointments. It's tragic, really. If I were you, I'd be embarrassed. The cabin was incredibly quiet. The only sound was the steady whoosh of the air conditioning. The flight attendants had stopped moving entirely, standing like statues near the galley. Even the assistant looked down at his shoes, unable to watch. The businessman took a step closer, invading the man's personal space again. He wanted to see the anger. He wanted to see the tears. He leaned down so that his face was only inches away from the man in the hoodie. "Where is everybody?" the businessman demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If you're so successful, if you're such a big deal, why are you alone? Where is your entourage? Where are the people laughing at your jokes? Where are the screaming fans?" The man in the hoodie didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. He just sat there looking up with those incredibly sad, incredibly deep eyes. There was a strength in that stillness that the businessman couldn't comprehend. It was the strength of a man who had faced real tragedy and survived it. A bully in a suit was nothing compared to that. "I'm alone because I wanted to be," the man said. His voice was clear and firm, cutting through the tension. "I'm tired. I just needed some quiet." "Quiet?" The businessman laughed, but it sounded nervous now. He was losing control of the narrative. "You're on a private jet with millionaires and you want quiet. You're a liar, you're lonely, you're sad. Look at you, you look like you're at a funeral." The man in the hoodie took a slow, deep breath. He didn't argue, he didn't shout back. He looked at the businessman with a gaze that was almost pitying. "I've been to a lot of funerals," he said softly, "more than I wish to share." The words landed like a stone in a pond. The businessman froze. He didn't know how to respond to that. It wasn't a comeback. It wasn't an insult. It was just a raw, honest truth that stripped away all the pretense. For a second, the businessman saw something real in the other man's eyes. A pain so deep that it made his own problems seem ridiculous. But the businessman's ego was too big to let him feel empathy for long. He shook it off, irritated that the mood hadn't gone his way. He straightened up, smoothing his tie, trying to regain his position of power. "Don't get emotional with me," he snapped. "I don't care about your sob stories, I care about the vibe. And you're ruining it." He leaned in one last time, his voice harsh and demanding. "Why are you so sad? Just answer me that. If you have all this money, if you can afford this flight, why do you look so miserable?" He waited, his chest heaving slightly, his face flushed. He was ready for the excuse. He was ready to tear it apart. He wanted to hear that the man was broke or divorced or sick. He wanted a reason to say, "I told you so." But the man in the hoodie didn't give him the satisfaction. He didn't offer an excuse. He simply looked the businessman in the eye and spoke with a quiet dignity that silenced the cabin. "I'm not miserable," he said. "I'm just thinking. And I have more than I can say, more than you could know." The businessman stared at him, mouth slightly open. The answer made no sense to him. It was a riddle he couldn't solve. "More than you can say," he repeated, mocking the tone. What is that supposed to mean? It meant that the man in the hoodie had gratitude, memories, and a heart that was still open despite the pain. It meant he had a life that was rich in ways that money couldn't buy. But the businessman couldn't see that. All he saw was a man in a dirty boots who refused to play the game by his rules. And that made him want to scream. The tension in the plane was tight, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The businessman opened his mouth to deliver another insult, to push harder, to break through that wall of calm. But before he could speak, the atmosphere shifted. A soft chime rang out through the cabin, and a low, sliding sound came from the front of the plane. The partition separating the main cabin from the forward galley was swooshing open. The businessman turned his head, distracted for the first time in minutes. He expected to see a waiter with more drinks. Instead, he saw a woman rushing out. She wasn't a member of the flight crew. She was a passenger, a woman dressed in elegant clothes, but her face was pale and streaked with tears. She looked frantic, her eyes scanning the rows of seats with desperate intensity. The businessman stepped back, confused. The moment of his triumph was slipping away. The drama he had created was suddenly interrupted by a real, raw emotion that had nothing to do with him. The woman ignored the rich leather seats and the important-looking men. She ignored the businessman entirely. Her eyes locked onto the back corner, onto the man in the worn hoodie. And as she saw him, a look of relief washed over her face, mixed with a fresh wave of tears. "Mr. Reeves," she choked out, her voice trembling so badly it was hard to understand her. "Please." "I'm so sorry to interrupt." The businessman was annoyed. He had been in the middle of a victory, a moment where he had finally forced the sad man in the corner to confront his own misery. But now this interruption was ruining his rhythm. He turned his body halfway, intending to wave the woman away or tell a flight attendant to handle her. He expected her to be asking for a drink or perhaps complaining about the temperature. But the woman didn't even look in his direction. She walked right past him as if he were a piece of furniture. Her eyes were fixed solely on the back corner of the plane. She was holding a small electronic tablet in her hands, gripping it so tightly that her knuckles were white. Her breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, and she was trembling visibly. The businessman stepped back, confused by this disregard. He looked at the woman, then at the man in the hoodie, and then back at the woman. The dynamic in the cabin had shifted instantly. The cruel game he was playing was forgotten, replaced by a sudden heavy gravity. The other passengers, who had been pretending to read or sleep, were now fully alert. They could feel the raw emotion coming from the woman. "I am so sorry," the woman said, her voice cracking. She reached the row where the quiet man was sitting and stopped, hovering over him. "I know you are trying to rest. I know this is incredibly rude. I told myself I wouldn't bother you, but—" She choked on a sob, covering her mouth with one hand for a moment. "But I saw you when we boarded, and I've been debating it the whole time, and I can't not ask." The man in the hoodie reacted instantly. There was no hesitation. He didn't act like a celebrity who was used to being approached, nor did he act like a tired stranger who wanted to be left alone. He moved with a fluid grace, sitting up straighter and swinging his legs around so he was facing her. His face, which had been so guarded and sad a moment ago, softened into an expression of deep concern. "It is all right," he said. His voice was gentle, a soothing anchor in the middle of her storm. "Please don't worry. What is it? Is everything okay?" The businessman stood frozen in the aisle. He was watching the scene unfold, but he felt like he was missing a crucial piece of information. Why was she asking him? Why was she looking at this man in the dirty boots with such desperate hope? It didn't make sense. The woman took a deep, shaky breath and held out the tablet. "It's my son," she whispered. He is in the hospital. He has been very sick for a long time. The treatments they are hard. He is in so much pain today." The man in the hoodie reached out and took the tablet gently. His movements were slow, careful not to startle her. "I am so sorry," he said, and he meant it. The sorrow in his eyes was not for show. It was a reflection of his own understanding of pain. "He loves you," the woman continued, tears streaming down her face now, smudging her makeup. "He watches your movies over and over. They are the only thing that make him smile when he hurts. He says you are a fighter. He says if you can get beat up and keep going, then he can too." The businessman's eyes went wide. The words hung in the air. "Your movies, a fighter." He looked at the man's face, really looked at it, stripping away the hoodie and the fatigue. Suddenly, the features clicked into place. The nose, the jawline, the intense dark eyes. It was the actor, the guy from the action movies, the one everyone liked, the one who was always in the memes. The businessman felt a cold splash of water hit his stomach. He had just spent the last 20 minutes mocking this man. He had insulted his clothes, his career, his life. He had called him a failure, a has-been, a loser. And now this woman was treating him like a saint, begging for his help because her son was dying. The realization made the businessman's knees feel weak. He opened his mouth to say something, to apologize, or maybe just to make a noise that would break the tension, but no sound came out. He was trapped in the silence of his own mistake. On the screen of the tablet, a video began to play. The man in the hoodie looked down. It showed a young boy, pale and thin, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by beeping machines. But the boy was smiling weakly at the camera, trying to be brave. "He is sleeping right now, but the nurse said he is in a lot of pain," the woman said, her voice trembling so hard she could barely get the words out. I wanted to ask if you could maybe say hello, just a short message for when he wakes up. I know it's too much to ask. I know I'm a stranger." The man in the hoodie didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't ask for a publicist. He didn't even check his watch. He looked up at the woman with a seriousness that was profound. "Of course," he said simply. "I would be honored." He shifted in his seat, adjusting the tablet so the camera captured his face clearly. He didn't try to fix his messy hair or straighten his worn-out clothes. He didn't put on a movie star face. He just looked like a regular guy, warm and kind. "Hey, buddy," he said softly to the camera. "I heard you are having a really tough day. I just wanted to tell you that you are incredibly strong, stronger than I am." He paused, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "I know it hurts, I know you are scared, but you are doing great. You are a warrior, and I'm thinking of you, okay? We're in this together." He spoke for another minute, not reciting a script, just speaking from his heart. He told a silly joke, something quiet and lighthearted to try and make the boy laugh. He promised that when the boy got better, they could maybe have a pizza party. The way he spoke, it was as if no one else existed in the world. It was just him and that sick child. The woman stood beside him, weeping quietly, her hand over her heart. The businessman watched, his face burning hot. He saw the contrast now, stark and undeniable. He, with all his money and his suit and his arrogance, had been spreading misery. He had been tearing someone down to make himself feel big. Meanwhile, the man he had mocked, the man he had called a loser, was using his last bit of energy to bring comfort to a stranger. The man in the hoodie stopped the recording and handed the tablet back to the woman. He reached out and squeezed her hand. "He is going to be okay," he said, though his voice was thick with emotion. "You are both doing an amazing job." "Thank you," the woman cried. "Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to us." She wanted to hug him, but she held back, respecting his space. She gave him a watery smile, wiped her face, and turned to walk back to her seat. As she passed the businessman, she didn't even glare at him. She just looked through him, her mind entirely focused on the gift she had just received for her son. The cabin was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Before, it had been a tense, suffocating silence filled with the cruelty of the businessman's words. Now, it was a reverent silence. The air felt cleaner, lighter. The businessman stood alone in the aisle. He looked down at his expensive shoes, then at the empty glass in his hand. He felt small. He felt dirty. He realized that while he had been measuring a man's worth by the price of his boots, he had completely missed the size of the man's heart. The actor sat back in his seat, the moment of heroism over. He didn't look for applause. He didn't look around to see if anyone was impressed. He just leaned his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes, exhaling a long, tired breath. He was still just a man in a hoodie. He was still tired. But the heavy sadness that surrounded him seemed to have lifted, just a little, replaced by the quiet light of having done something good. The businessman wanted to say something. He wanted to say, "I didn't know," or "I'm sorry." But the words felt like dust in his mouth. He knew that no apology could erase the ugliness he had spewed out just moments before. He had shown his true colors, and they were ugly compared to the simple grace of the man in the corner. Slowly, feeling like his legs were made of lead, the businessman turned and walked back to his own seat. He didn't swagger this time. He didn't look at anyone else. He sat down and stared straight ahead, unable to meet the eyes of the other passengers who were looking at him with judgment and disappointment. The regret was already beginning to eat away at him, a cold, hard lump in his chest that he knew wouldn't go away for a very long time. The silence that filled the cabin after the woman walked away was heavy. But it was different from the tense quiet that had existed before. It was a respectful silence, the kind that falls over a room when something sacred has just happened. The air felt cleaner, as if the actor's kindness had pushed out the stuffiness of the businessman's ego. The businessman sat back down in his plush leather seat, but the comfort was gone. The chair suddenly felt hard and unwelcoming. He looked at his glass of expensive scotch, the ice having melted slightly, diluting the amber liquid. He didn't want it anymore. He pushed it away on the small table, the glass making a soft, scraping sound against the polished surface. His mind was racing. He kept hearing his own voice echoing in his head. "You look like a loser. You peaked in the 90s. The words sounded ugly now, jagged and cruel. He replayed the moment he mocked the boots. He remembered sneering at the worn leather and the scuffed toes. And then he saw the image of the actor holding that tablet, speaking to a sick child with more tenderness than the businessman had probably shown in his entire life. The contrast was suffocating. The businessman had everything he thought mattered: the custom-tailored suit, the diamond watch, the private jet, the power to make people jump when he snapped his fingers. He had used all that power to try to hurt a stranger, and the stranger, with his tired eyes and old clothes, had used his power to heal. He had used his fame not to demand attention, but to give comfort to a mother and a dying boy. The businessman felt a hot flush creeping up his neck. It wasn't the warmth of the sun or the heat of the cabin, it was the burning feeling of shame. He looked around the plane. The other passengers weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him with pity, or worse, with disgust. They had seen his true colors. They had seen that behind the expensive suit was a man who was small on the inside. Even his assistant, who usually sat ready to take notes or fetch drinks, was quietly packing up his laptop. He didn't look at his boss. He couldn't. The silence between them was loud. The assistant had seen the cruelty, and it had changed the way he saw the man who signed his paychecks. That realization hurt the businessman more than he wanted to admit. He could buy loyalty, but he couldn't buy respect after he had thrown it away. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they were beginning their descent. The businessman felt a wave of relief. He wanted to get off this plane. He wanted to be away from the quiet man in the back corner. He felt like he was trapped in a box with his own guilt, and the walls were closing in. He looked back one last time. The actor was sitting with his eyes closed, resting again. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't whispering to anyone about what a hero he was. He was just sitting there, breathing softly, exhausted by the emotional weight of the interaction. He hadn't done it for show. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. The plane touched down on the runway with a bump. The engines roared in reverse as the aircraft slowed down. The seatbelt sign dinged off. The businessman stood up immediately. He needed to move. He needed to escape. He grabbed his expensive leather bag, clutching it tightly to his chest like a shield. He stood in the aisle, waiting for the door to open. The line moved slowly. The other passengers were gathering their things, many of them glancing toward the back of the plane with smiles of gratitude for the actor. But when their eyes swept past the businessman, they quickly looked away. As the line inched forward, the businessman found himself standing right next to the actor's row. His heart pounded in his chest. He felt an overwhelming urge to say something. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to blurt out, "I didn't know," or "I'm sorry I was such a jerk." He opened his mouth, his throat dry and dusty. The actor opened his eyes and looked up. Their eyes met. There was no anger in the actor's gaze. There was no judgment. There was just a calm, quiet understanding. It was a look that said, "I see you. I know you're struggling too." That look broke the businessman. He realized that an apology wouldn't fix anything. You can't just take back being mean because you got caught or because you felt guilty later. The meanness was what was inside him, and the actor had seen it. The businessman couldn't speak. The words stuck in his throat. He just stood there, frozen for a second that felt like an hour. The actor gave him a slow, gentle nod. It wasn't a nod of forgiveness exactly, but a nod of acknowledgement, a sign that the game was over. The businessman gave a stiff, jerky nod back and turned away. He hurried toward the exit, almost tripping over his own expensive shoes. He walked past the flight attendants, unable to meet their eyes. He stepped out of the aircraft and into the jet bridge. The cool air hit his face, but it didn't cool down the burning in his cheeks. He walked quickly through the terminal, his footsteps echoing on the shiny floor. He was surrounded by luxury again, the VIP lounge, the chauffeurs waiting with signs, but none of it felt real. It felt like a movie set he was walking through, but he wasn't the star. He was just an extra. He reached the exit where his car was waiting. The driver opened the door for him. The businessman slid into the back seat, sinking into the dark leather. The door closed with a solid thud, sealing him in his own private world again. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. "Just drive," the businessman said, his voice sounding hollow. "Just take me home." As the car pulled away from the airport, merging onto the busy highway, the businessman looked out the window. He watched the city lights blurring past. He thought about the woman and her son. He thought about the boots that had walked through so much. He realized that he was the poorest person on that flight. He had millions in the bank, but his heart was empty. He had spent the afternoon trying to make a man feel small, only to discover that the man was a giant. The businessman leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. He made a silent promise to himself, a promise he hoped he would remember the next time he felt the urge to sneer at someone. He promised that he would try to be better. He promised that he would stop measuring people by their price tags and start seeing them by their actions. It was a small start, but as the car sped through the night, it was the only thing he had. He was alone with his thoughts, carrying the heavy, quiet regret of a man who finally understood that being rich doesn't make you a winner, and being kind doesn't make you a loser.